Jack Rudolph from South Africa scored a historic double century on his debut against Bangladesh. From New Zealand, Scott Styris scored 107 runs on his debut against West Indies. Lawrence Winsett scored a century against Australia on his debut. From India, Virender Sehwag scored a century on his debut against South Africa. Mohammad Ashraful scored 114 runs against Sri Lanka on his debut test. Taufiq Umar scored a century against Bangladesh on his test debut. T. Smarvira scored a century against India. Hamilton Masakadza from Zimbabwe scored 119 runs against West Indies. Aminul Islam from Bangladesh scored 145 runs against India. One of the best batsmen from Pakistan, Yunus Khan scored a century on his debut against Sri Lanka. From New Zealand, Matthew Sinclair scored a double century on his debut against West Indies. Azhar Mahmood from Pakistan scored a century against South Africa on his debut innings. Ali Naqvi scored 115 runs against South Africa on his debut innings. Mohammad Wasim from Pakistan scored a century on his debut innings against New Zealand. Sourav Ganguly from India scored 131 runs against England. Graham Thorpe scored 114 runs not out on his debut innings against Australia. R.S. Kaluvidrana from Sri Lanka scored 132 runs not out against Australia. A.C. Hudson from South Africa scored 163 runs against West Indies. Mark Waugh from Australia scored 138 runs on debut innings against England. MJ Greatbatch scored a century against England on his debut. From Sri Lanka, D.S. Kurupu scored a double century against New Zealand on his debut test. Mohammad Azharuddin from India scored 130 runs not out on his debut innings against England. Legendary batsman from Pakistan, Salim Malik scored a century on his debut against Sri Lanka. Javed Miandad from Pakistan scored 163 runs against New Zealand on his debut test. S. Amarnath from India scored 124 runs against New Zealand. From West Indies, C.J. Greenidge scored a century against India on his debut innings. Algero from West Indies scored a double century against New Zealand on his debut innings. Greg Chappell scored a century against England on his test debut. From India, G.R. Vishwanath scored 137 runs against Australia